Hi, you've probably heard that SpaceX went public at a valuation near $2 trillion, dollars, instantly making it one of the most valuable companies on the planet.
SpaceX's blockbuster IPO may prove to be the largest on record, with the company seeking valuations near $2 trillion.
A few months before that, Elon Musk announced plans for the combined company to build data centers in orbit. Elon put a number on when this becomes the obvious place to build.
My prediction is that it will be by far the cheapest place to put AI will be space in 36 months or less.
Elon is also famous for missing his own deadlines, so the honest question isn't whether he will hit that number. It's whether the idea underneath is even pointed in the right direction. To answer that, you need to understand what a data center actually is, what happens inside one over its lifetime, and then ask which of those things still work once you remove the ground underneath them. Start with the basic question. What is a data center physically? The easiest comparison is your laptop scaled up by a factor of thousands and spread across a building. Inside that building, you can sort almost anything into 7 layers, and each one turns out to matter for the space question in a different way. The first layer is real estate, the land, the building, the structural shell that contains everything else. It sounds boring, and on Earth it mostly is. You buy land, you get permits, you build a structure. The second layer is power, the transformers, battery banks, and distribution systems that move electricity from the grid into a form every other system can use. The third is environment control, which in practice means cooling. Servers generate enormous amounts of heat the same way an overworked laptop gets hot on your knees, except multiplied across thousands of machines packed into one room. The fourth layer is the one most people picture when they hear data center, the actual computers. Compute, which is like the processor in your phone, storage, which is like its hard drive, and networking, which moves data between the two. The fifth layer is connectivity, the cables, internal and external, that link all of this to the rest of the internet. A data center that can't talk to the outside world is just an expensive room. The sixth layer is physical security, badge readers, cameras, guards. The same way a bank protects a vault even though security isn't what a bank is for. And the seventh is fire protection. Specialized suppression systems, because a fire in a data center doesn't just damage a building, it can take down digital services for an entire region. Here's why this 7-layer breakdown is worth sitting with for a second. Each of these layers supports its own multi-billion-dollar industry. Companies like Dell, Nvidia, Cisco, and Supermicro live in the IT equipment layer. Companies like Schneider Electric and Vertiv live in power and cooling. If you've ever wondered what a company like Nvidia or Cisco actually does all day, the answer is somewhere in the stack. And if you're trying to figure out whether putting that stack into orbit makes sense, you now have 7 separate things to check, not one. But a data center isn't just these 7 layers thrown into a room. The way they are arranged has been refined over roughly 70 years, and that history is where the space problem starts to show up. In the 1940s through the 1960s, data centers were just rooms built around a single giant mainframe computer. By the 1970s and 80s, standardized racks and raised floors showed up, mostly to manage airflow and cabling. The 1990s brought the commercial internet, which meant external connectivity became the whole point, and co-location facilities emerged. These were buildings where multiple companies rent space side by side. The 2000s and 2010s brought hyperscale. Amazon, Google, and Meta building data centers so large that a 1% improvement in cooling efficiency translates into real money. And today, AI workloads are forcing yet another redesign because a rack full of GPUs running an AI model produces far more heat in far less space than anything that came before it. Out of that 70-year evolution came a handful of layout principles that every modern data center follows, and each one quietly assumes the existence of gravity. Take cooling. Modern data centers arrange server racks in rows with the fronts of the servers facing a cold aisle and the backs facing a hot aisle. Cold air goes in the front, hot air comes out the back. And a lot of that air movement happens because hot air rises and cold air sinks. That's convection, and convection is a gravity effect. Take weight. When a data center upgrades its hardware, technicians often need forklifts to move fully loaded server racks, which means the building has to be designed around aisle widths and floor loading limits. But weight is also a gravity effect. No gravity, no weight, and arguably no forklifts. And take redundancy. Data centers duplicate their power and cooling systems across separate rooms or wings so that a fire or a flood on one side doesn't take down the whole facility. That's a sensible defense against Earth-based disasters. In orbit, fire and flood aren't your problem. Radiation and micro-meteoroid impacts are. The defense has to be rebuilt for a completely different set of threats. So that's what a data center is made of and how its layout came to look the way it does. The next question is what actually happens inside one day to day and year to year, because a data center isn't a thing you build once and walk away from. Every data center goes through 3 stages. Construction is when you acquire land, get permits, and install the power, cooling, and computing systems. In accounting terms, this is capital expenditure or capex, money spent on assets that depreciate over time. A building might be depreciated over 20 to 40 years. The computing equipment inside it just 3 to 5. Operation is the long middle stage where the facility is switched on and actually does work. And this stage is far from static. Equipment gets refreshed, capacity gets expanded, retrofits happen constantly, and there are entire playbooks for things like security incidents, software updates, and preventive maintenance. Financially, this ongoing stage is operating expenditure or OPEX. Electricity, water, maintenance, and staff are some of the things that you spend money on during this stage. And then there is decommissioning. Pulling equipment out, reselling or disposing of it, and then either tearing down the building or repurposing it. To see why this 3-stage cycle matters for the space question, it helps to zoom into just one piece of equipment, data storage, for example. When you buy a laptop, your storage choice is basically binary, a hard drive or a solid-state drive, cheaper versus faster. In a data center, the choice gets much more layered for a reason that's easiest to see through one company, Amazon. When you're adding something to your Amazon cart, the system needs to respond in milliseconds because a slow checkout page is a lost sale. That's a direct hit to revenue. But the same company also runs huge overnight reports that crunch hundreds of millions of transactions, and for that job, millisecond response times don't matter at all. What matters is moving enormous amounts of data at once. One job is like a taxi you call on demand. The other is like a bus, slower to start, but it moves far more at a time. Both jobs run on storage systems, but the systems are built differently even when the underlying parts look similar. On top of that, storage vendors, Dell, NetApp, HP, and others, each build their systems with their own architecture and software, which means once you buy 100 terabytes of storage from one of them, expanding to 120 terabytes later usually means buying from the same vendor again. And every few years, this equipment needs upgrading, and the storage systems themselves are usually fully replaced every 7 to 8 years. On the ground, replacing a rack of storage means technicians, forklifts, cable changes, and a process for making sure sensitive data doesn't end up on equipment that gets thrown away. Almost all of that is done by humans today on Earth. Now hold that thought and add up what all of this costs. On a typical data center, land roughly makes up 15% of construction costs and power makes up roughly 25%. On the ongoing operating side, land is about 20% of costs and power is about 40%. The entire pitch for space-based data centers rests on the idea that 2 of the biggest line items on this list, land and power, could become radically cheaper or radically more abundant once you leave the planet. So, does that pitch survive contact with everything we just walked through? Here's the honest answer. Feasibility is low today. Not because it's physically impossible. Nothing here violates a law of physics, but because the financial and operational picture doesn't close. And it doesn't close for 3 specific reasons, each one a direct continuation of what you just learned. The first reason is that every layout principle developed over 70 years assumes gravity, and none of those assumptions transfer. The convection-based cooling strategy, the floor loading and forklift logistics, the redundancy plan built around fire and flood, all of it has to be redesigned from a blank page. Removing gravity doesn't just remove constraints, it removes the constraints that the entire design language of a data center was built around and replaces them with a different set: launch vibration, mechanical stress during ascent, radiation, and micrometeoroids. The second reason is the equipment itself. On Earth, installing and upgrading IT equipment is a human job, and because technology keeps improving, that job repeats every few years. Remember the 7 to 8 year storage replacement cycle? In space, you can't simply send a technician with a cart and a forklift. Either the equipment has to be engineered so that robots or some future system can install and replace it with far less human involvement, or you need people trained as both astronauts and data center technicians. Neither of those exists today, and the economics of either path are completely unclear. The third reason is power, and it is the sharpest one. AI workloads are exactly what's driving demand for more power per rack, and power in space comes overwhelmingly from sunlight, unless you're talking about nuclear power, which is its own enormous undertaking. For scale, the International Space Station, one of the largest solar-powered objects ever put into orbit, generates an average of 75 to 100 kilowatts, with a peak of 240 kilowatts when its solar arrays, which span about the length of a football field, are fully lit. A single mid-sized data center on Earth runs continuously at around 50 megawatts. That's roughly 500 times the average output of the International Space Station. And the largest AI facilities being built today run at 100 to 500 megawatts. To match even one mid-sized Earth data center in orbit, you'd need to generate something like 500 times what humanity's largest orbital power system produces right now. There are only two obvious ways to close that gap, and both run into walls. You could build smaller orbital data centers, but that fights against the economies of scale that make data centers economical in the first place. The fixed costs of getting something into orbit, shielding it from radiation, and running it without humans nearby get spread across less and less computing power. Or you could make the equipment and the solar panels dramatically more efficient. Some of that is happening incrementally, but closing a gap measured in hundreds of times, not percentages, requires a breakthrough nobody can put a date on. Those three reasons cover design, equipment, and power. But two more questions sit underneath all of them, and neither has a clean answer yet. The first is accounting. Every cost category covered earlier, the capex of construction, the opex of running the facility, the eventual cost of decommissioning, has to be repriced for orbit. And right now, almost none of those numbers exist in a form anyone can verify. Launch costs are falling, but shielding, redundancy, and the near total absence of on-site human labor all push in the other direction, and nobody has published a credible full life cycle estimate. The second is security. On the ground, physical security means badges, cameras, and guards protecting a building that isn't going anywhere. In orbit, the building itself is the thing that has to survive collision, debris, and an environment where you can't simply walk over and check in on it. Both of these are solvable in principle. Neither is solved in practice, and both sit on top of the three structural problems we discussed earlier, rather than replacing them. So where does that leave Elon's 30 to 36 month claim? Probably nowhere close to true, and it's a safe bet that Elon knows that too.
What I'm trying to illustrate is that sometimes I say the wrong thing.
But that doesn't mean that the project is pointless. What SpaceX can actually do in the next few years is lay groundwork, build early versions of compute, storage, cooling, and power systems designed for orbit from the ground up, even at small scale, even before the economics work. People and companies get better at things by doing them repeatedly. And if SpaceX finds even one narrow use case where an orbital data center makes sense despite all of this, that wedge into the market is what will eventually enable them to make the economics work. The 30 to 36 month number is the headline. The real timeline is whatever it takes to go from a single working prototype to the 10th one and then the 100th. And nobody, including Elon, actually knows how long that's going to take. It's also worth noting before we wrap up that Elon's envisioned orbital data centers are intentionally much smaller than the ones we have on Earth. He's thinking about facilities generating roughly 120 to 150 kilowatts of computing power each, compared to the 50 megawatts or 50,000 kilowatts that a mid-sized ground data center runs at continuously. That gap in scale is exactly why Elon is talking about launching 1 million of them. Getting compute capacity to a level that moves the needle globally requires extraordinary volume when each individual unit is that small. We will revisit this topic as SpaceX and Elon make progress towards turning that vision into reality. But before you go, step back from the space question for a second, because what you just did is more than assess one company's moonshot. Answering the orbital data center question required taking a full tour through an industry that has quietly produced dozens of $100 billion companies. If you're an investor trying to understand what a company like Nvidia or Cisco actually does all day, an entrepreneur looking for where the next opportunity in this space might sit, or someone who just wants to understand the real world equipment that your favorite software products run on, you now have that foundation. The orbital data center question is fascinating. But while that idea is exciting, the real money today is actually being made right here in the data center industry on the ground. And now you understand why. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic, so share them with me in the comments. I will catch you next time.